Good evening, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, our Polish and global audience, welcome to another edition of Votum TV on our Heretics channel. We have a very, very special guest whom I've been waiting for since time immemorial to have on our show, the one, the only Scott Ritter. Scott, how are you doing out there in New York?
I'm doing very well, thank you. How are you doing?
Perfect, perfect. I just want to say at the very beginning that I know you have the cup probably in your hand, but I also have this in my hand. So for everybody, this is Scott's latest book, Disarmament in a Time of Perestroika. Link to get it is in the description box, which you will see below our video. It's a book. It's a template for what needs to happen, what happened already, and a sign of hope in a troubled world. And this is, I think, Scott's 9th book, if I'm not mistaken. Highly recommended, and maybe for all those Polish people watching out there, we might do soon. We'll see where we go from there. So, Scott, you are, as our channel is called, a heretic in the sense that you go against the mainstream narrative, like several of our other Colonel Douglas McGregor, we had Larry C. Johnson, Dr. Gordon Hahn, but you, I would say, you're like the superstar of the heretics going against the, I mean, the Ukrainians are after you. They're calling you, I've seen websites where you're considered a Russian stooge, a KGB spy, a guy who betrayed his own country. So my first question that I want to put to you, because I want you to treat this interview as if somebody in the Polish presidential palace or in the prime minister's residence was watching this interview. So Scott Ritter, please tell us, do you think you have right to comment on anything that happens in Ukraine? What makes you have the proper CV, the credentials? I'm going to play devil's advocate a little here, but
No, that's fair.
Why should Scott comment on the situation in Ukraine?
No, that's a very fair question, and one that should be asked. I think it should be asked of anybody who's commenting on issues. You know, what makes their voice more relevant, etc. I mean, on the surface, to be honest with you, nothing. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and sell myself as the modern day incarnation of, a Harvard PhD academic. I'm not a diplomat who served in Ukraine. I have limited experience with Ukraine. So, I think when you look at it that way, nothing separates me from my dogs who tend to bark at the most inopportune times. But let's see if they can calm down for a second. This isn't about Ukraine. There's 3 of them, so it's Maverick and 2 others. This isn't about Ukraine. If this was about, Ukrainian domestic politics, etc., I probably would stay silent. Let's just be honest here. I didn't seek out this attention. When this issue arose, I had written on it extensively from a perspective of energy security. I write for a group called Energy Intelligence Group. Their clientele are the top oil companies and energy companies in the world. And the dogs are really excited about this topic. I just can't. I'm sorry for that. I looked at this from the standpoint of from the Russian angle. What is Russia going to do about the issue of NATO expansion? What is Russia going to do about the issue of American efforts to block Russian energy from going into Europe? The fear on the part of the United States that that Russia was using energy as a weapon to blackmail Europe, to get Europe to to maybe not be so enthusiastic about implementing American policies. And so I wrote a number of articles in the fall of 2021 that highlighted it. And one of the things that came out of those articles is I said that I think that if there was going to be a war, it was a war that was going to result in the destruction of Ukraine, a war that was going to result in the economic devastation of Europe and the global isolation of the Western Bloc. Based upon these articles, I was asked by somebody, I think in January, to go on a podcast. I had never done a podcast before in my life up until that point. And I did the podcast, and next thing I know, everybody's saying, "Hey, could you come on this podcast? Come on this podcast." And I became popular. I think one of the reasons is that I was saying things that weren't being replicated in the mainstream media. It was a different take on the problem. Now, to get to the root of your question, okay, what gives me the right to talk about Russia? Well, gosh, I don't know. I grew up as a child of the Cold War. I basically made a decision after graduating high school that I was going to join the military to defend my country against the Soviet Union at that time. Kill a commie for mommy was a real thing. Better dead than red. It wasn't a joke. It was the real thing. And I made a decision to go in the Marine Corps. I studied Russian history in college because you got to know your enemy. I took the Russian language, and I got commissioned in the Marine Corps. Was made an intelligence officer, and I spent the first 2.5 years of my time in the Marine Corps training to kill Russians. That's all I did. I learned Russian doctrine, and I was singularly focused on defeating the Soviet threat on the field of battle. In 1987, December 8th, we just had the 35th anniversary the other day, Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev signed the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. I won't get into the history of the treaty and why it's so important, but it's a big deal. It basically initiated the process of on-site inspection. Yeah, there's the story of it right there in the book. On-site inspection as a primary component of arms control compliance verification. That is, to put humans on the ground in the inspected party's territory to carry out visual confirmation that the other side was in compliance. People always say, "How do you become an expert in that?" And my answer to that is, I throw the question back: what makes somebody an expert? And they'll say, "Well, a degree, this, that, and everything." No, man, that means everybody's an expert. What makes you the expert is to be the first person to do it. Because no one else did it, you're it. And I was the first person to do on-site inspection. I was literally the first inspector on the ground in the Soviet Union. I helped write the book about on-site inspection. And I was in the Soviet Union in Russia during a pivotal time in their history, the time of perestroika. Because between June 1988 and July 1990, those are the periods that I was working there, Mikhail Gorbachev sought to basically radically transform Soviet society through the policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. And I was right there in a Soviet military factory town, seeing firsthand how these policies were implemented amongst Russian society, Soviet society. So it wasn't just about learning about missile inspections and learning about arms control. It was learning about, it was an immersive course in Soviet society, Russian society. And I emerged from that experience with I think a deep understanding of what made the Soviet people tick and what made Russian people tick. I'm not claiming expertise. I mean, gosh, it was 2 years. There's people who study the Soviet Union for a lifetime and can't say they have it figured out. But it gave me insights. And that's what I'll claim, is to have insights. And then from that moment, I was never far from the Russian problem, so to speak. I have relatives who are in Russia. I worked very closely with the Russian government, Russian intelligence services, and Russian experts during my time as a UN weapons inspector in Iraq. And from an academic standpoint, I followed it. I read up on it. I especially followed, the development in, Russian military, the changes that were taking place. So I felt comfortable writing about the Russian military. I felt comfortable writing about Russia and its relationship with the rest of the world. And when the issue of Ukraine came up, I felt comfortable talking about, why Russia would feel compelled to do what they did in Ukraine. I have had to take a crash course in modern Ukrainian nationalism. I mean, I'm familiar with a lot. I've been following, like I said, I'm a student of Soviet history, so I'm very familiar with Stepan Bandera, the organization of Ukrainian nationalism, the relationship between the Bandera organization, the CIA. These things I'm familiar with. But I have to admit that from say 1992 on, I didn't follow Ukraine intimately. In 1997, I did have the opportunity to travel to Ukraine as a UN official. I went there as part of a team that was investigating the black market activities of certain Ukrainian individuals who were stealing missile-related technology from the decrepit Ukrainian missile industry and trying to sell it to Iraq. My job was, of course, preventing Iraq from acquiring prohibited technologies, prohibited weapons capabilities. So I did go to Kiev. I did interface at very high levels with the Ukrainian security services and the National Security Council. But that was a limited exposure. I can't claim to have in-depth knowledge and insight into Ukraine. So I've been, trying my best to learn about this, but people keep asking me to come on and talk about things. I do my best to answer truthfully. A lot of what I do is assessment and analysis, which means that I take a look at facts. I am a trained analyst, by the way. That's what I've done my entire life. And so there is a method to my madness, so to speak. I just don't pull facts out of thin air. I'm somebody who is accustomed to gathering information, evaluating information, and then assessing it, trying to put it into some sort of, logical, sequence, and then briefing people about what's the most important thing about this information. I've done that at the highest levels imaginable, from the President of the United States on down, and so I apply that skill set to Ukraine. But I always tell people, don't view me as the Bible. I'm not. I mean, literally, I'm not the Bible on Russia and Ukraine. I'm an analyst. And what I would prefer people to do is view me as a Russian propagandist. And the reason why I say that is because I think it's a failing on anybody to accept at face value what anybody says about anything. Because then you're not exercising the most powerful weapon in the world, which is what is in between these two earlobes. It's important for people to develop their own opinion on a matter. So assume that what I'm saying is disinformation, challenge what I say, and then go out and do your own research to confirm what I say. Trust but verify. And at the end of the day, if what I say is confirmed by you to be factually correct and therefore, logically constructed, you might say, okay, I support that. But that's you saying, I support that, as opposed to saying, oh, he said that, therefore it is.
Right. Well, Scott, I remember this was like the heady days of preparations for the war in Iraq. This was like 2003, 2004. I was still living in North America then, as you could probably tell by my accent. And I would hear on the radio this, former UN Inspector Scott Ritter, talking about Iraq and Syria as a mass destruction. I say, okay, everybody back then, I had my doubts, but it was pretty interesting to see such a high level Americans speaking about these topics. Now, you were obviously, as some people are trying to do right now, drowned out by the mainstream, at least after a certain point, which is kind of sad. But I think it's important what you said about applying that skill set, because that skill set should be applied. I'm not saying by the typical journalist, but at least the people who come to the studios. And we're coming, well, to the Atlantic in Poland and in North America. And let me just give you a background of where we are in Poland right now in terms of how the Polish mainstream is presenting the entire Russian situation. After 1989, one can say with like 100% certainty that the Polish society has been conditioned not to view Russia as a problem, where we have problematic relations and we have to rebuild these relations, but to see in Russians alien civilization, somebody you can't do business, somebody that is an orc, as they're being called right now. The evil empire is still alive. They're always cunning. They're always thinking about how to invade Poland, and that has never gotten away. And one of the reasons, I think, behind such an attitude, I think is sort of on display in a book that was published last year by John Pomfret. He's an American. The book is called From Warsaw with Love. I highly recommend it. And it basically shows how Polish Secret Service letters at the 80s were basically taken over by the free. And this is a fairly sincere account of what happened. Pomfret, so he's writing, oh, look how great allies the Poles are. They just gave everything to us, for nothing, literally for nothing. And ever since those late 80s, I think the interplay between the secret services of the United States and Poland as a sort of subservient local secret service has influenced thinking in this regard that we're supposed to be, at least that's how many realists in Poland view it, and not this American Rottweiler barking constantly at Russia at the behest of somebody at the American Enterprise Institute or the State Department. So from your vantage point, do you think my assessment is correct as an American who's seen these things up close? Are you seeing the same thing in terms of Polish policy in this turbulent situation vis-a-vis Moscow and vis-a-vis Ukraine?
I do. I actually, my assessment runs parallel. I mean, I don't have the intimate details that you have, or about the CIA relationship with Poland, but what you can look at certain things about the insights. When the Warsaw Pact dissolved, when the Berlin Wall went down, you had basically Western Europe, which was composed of the original NATO members who had a long established relationship with the United States. And then you had the Eastern Bloc countries, which were desperate to break free of the control of the Soviet Union and to define themselves as a new nation. And I mean, I don't think, maybe some people take umbrage at this, but the desperation came from not being mature as a modern nation state, uncomfortable with their own history, uncomfortable with who they are, what they are, where they wanted to go. And so, like a child, and again, I don't mean to be insulting, but these are, I view Poland, the Baltics, and the others as children, are in desperate need of adult supervision. So they turn to the United States and they say, we basically turn ourselves over to you. We want to be part of you. We want to be part of your family. And we will do what you want us to do. And you saw this reflected in the cynicism of Donald Rumsfeld. If you remember in the lead up to the Iraq War, Donald Rumsfeld made a statement about old Europe and new Europe, making the difference between the two. And at that point in time, if Poland didn't understand what he was saying, let me help you. He was saying that the United States is going to use you as a wedge against old Europe in the reticence on the part of the old European nations about this war in Iraq. And I think that should have been the wake-up call, that the relationship between Poland and the United States is not one of child-parent, because that's a nurturing relationship. When a parent nurtures a child, brings a child in, they try to raise the child into adulthood to be a fully functioning adult capable of leaving the house and surviving on their own. That's the last thing the United States wants. We're not here to nurture you. We're here to control you. Also, the United States, this isn't a friendship. A friendship is one, again, I help a friend get up. A friendship is based upon mutual respect, reciprocity. The United States is not your friend. The United States is using you. You exist to do that which the United States needs you to do at a given point in a given time. This isn't a relationship. A relationship implies like a husband and wife. People who love each other, like each other. There's some difficulties. I mean, find me a marriage that's gone on for any length of time where there hasn't been some fighting. But marriage, you work through it because you care about the person. You want the person to be fully developed, to have a full life with you. It's a partnership. That's not the relationship. This isn't even the relationship between, a John and a mistress. That implies some sort of financial thing where we're paying them well. You're getting well compensated for what. This is the relationship between a John and a cheap hooker. And I don't mean to be too blunt, but that's what Poland is. Cheap hooker. America is using you simply using you for its own benefit, its own, and at the end of the day, we will throw you away. We will never return your call. We will turn our back on you because you don't matter to us. That's just the simple truth. Now, there's plenty of Americans of Polish descent who will say, Scott, you're wrong. Poland matters to me. Of course it does. You have relatives. You have a vested interest. There's a link there. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the U.S. government does not care about Poland. Poland is only useful to us as long as they are useful to us. Meaning if Poland gives us what we need, what we want, what we desire, then we will have a relationship with them. But the second Poland becomes inconvenient, the second Poland becomes a burden, goodbye. That's just what we do. And I think the Polish people, and I say this about all Eastern European countries, we don't have extensive history with you. You're not our friends. You're not our friends. You're barely an acquaintance. And we only have a relationship with you because of the nation to your east, Russia. We are using you to implement our policy objectives with Russia. If we could implement those policy objectives without you, you wouldn't matter. We would forget about you because you don't count. That's just the way it is.
I could say this as a poll, and by the way, thanks for that, for those words. They were definitely needed because we need a cold shower here in Poland. I'll give you an example. I mean, the rocket attack possibly on Przewodu from a few civilians. It's been basically hushed out. There's an investigation ongoing, but Ukrainians haven't apologized formally. Nobody has said anything about, hey, maybe we should, maybe close down the border a little bit, exact some sort of, compensation for what happened. I don't know. Maybe there's something happening behind the scenes, but there's this intricate element in the Polish elite after 1989. These are guys who came out of solidarity, most of them. So they were used to the United States. And no matter how hard, you could look at the entire history of the Third Republic, the last 30 years of Poland, no matter how hard we get smacked by Washington. For example, the current ambassador in Poland is the son of Zbigniew Brzezinski, by the way, who's at the same time instructing, in a way, our politicians in power what to do vis-a-vis Russia, while at the same time with opposition figures. And our government just takes it because everybody believes that if you talk to them, that's our modus operandi. We mean well, or we meant well. You're saying, I mean, it's complete lunacy to continue this line of thought and this line of political activism in international affairs. Am I right, Scott?
I believe so. I mean, look, Poland's in a difficult position. Let's not deny that. You can't blame Poland given its history, and I'm somewhat familiar with Polish history, especially in the 20th century. I mean, out of World War One. I'm a student of the Polish-Soviet War. I know what the miracle of Vistula was. And I'm also familiar with Molotov and Ribbentrop. I know the betrayal that the Polish people feel at the hands of both Germany and the Soviet Union. I know how Poland acquired Silesia, and I know how Poland lost what is now Western Ukraine. I'm familiar with this history, and it's a difficult history. It is a difficult history. I'm familiar with the Solidarity movement. Lech Walesa was, I can't say he was a hero of mine, but he's somebody that I followed very closely with great admiration, in the effort to build up, what appeared to be at that time a nascent democratic movement in Poland. But, Poland is a victim of its own difficult history. One only has to dissect the political and economic elites and look at their sources, where they came from, et cetera, to understand what's going on in Poland. like any nation, it has complexities. It has internal domestic competitions that have to be dealt with. Um, but when we deal with Ukraine, one of the fascinating aspects of it is what is Poland's intention with Western Ukraine? What is Poland's intention with Lvov? What is what is Poland's relationship with the Zelensky government, given its close connectivity with you know Bandera movements? Have the Poles forgotten about Volodin? Forgotten about the murders? 110,000 Polish citizens murdered by Western Ukrainians. Have the Poles forgot that? I mean, you used the word orc. I'm curious, do the Poles call the Russians orcs as well? If so, shame on you. But the inherent racism of that term, so if you're a Pole calling the Russians orc, understand that in the eyes of the Western Ukrainians, you're less than that. You're nothing. You're subhuman. They would take your villagers and burn them to death, slaughter them, butcher them. I don't understand the attractiveness on the part of Poland to the Zelensky government, to this neo-Nazi, ultra-nationalistic, white supremacist movement that has seized control in Ukraine. It's mind-boggling that the Poles, given their history, could ever ally themselves with this. I'm not saying that Poland should join in the invasion, but maybe Poland should. The best course of action for Poland would be to get rid of this hateful ideology, because it's a cancer. Ukraine is a cancer that resides between Europe and NATO and Russia. And a cancer doesn't pick what part of the body it's going to infect. It's going to metastasize everywhere. So if you think that the Ukrainian cancer is solely going to hurt Russia, you're wrong. The Ukrainian cancer is going to kill Poland. It's going to impact the Baltic states. It's going to impact everybody it touches. And that's what I don't understand with the current Polish government, why they're blindly engaged in policies that basically advance the cause of an ideology premised on the subhuman status of Poles in the mass murder of Polish citizens.
Well, some of the unofficial Taiwan and like Looney Tunes on steroids, literally, is some clever politicians of the Law and Justice Party are saying, well, right now we have a chance to geopolitically weaken Russia and reconstitute the Polish-Ukrainian element of what used to be the Commonwealth. So we're going to have two nations, a geopolitical bloc, a strong political bloc that'll have a weakened Russia, and will have the most powerful states behind us. That's the message that's coming from the low-level politicians of the ruling party. Now, the president, Duda, Looney Tunes, by the way, Duda, in May, said during the 3rd of May Constitution celebrations that, I quote, there should not be a border between Poland and Ukraine. His words. He was suggesting that they should be knocked down and we should come back into this confederacy, this Commonwealth, which in the eyes of many Polish historians didn't work out. The saying Poles and Ukrainians for Ukrainians has a lot of sense into it. But let's leave Poland for now. Scott, where are we in the Ukrainian war? What are we going to see possibly in the next couple of weeks? Because we know Surovikin is gathering forces to the east. When might we expect the huge punch that everybody is expecting now that the snow has fallen, freezing? What's your assessment?
Well, remember that war is an extension of politics by other means. So we can't just jump to the military potential that's being accumulated by the Russians. I mean, if you do that, of course, it makes sense. When the remaining 175,000 mobilized reservists finally are formed into combat capable units. And I just like to, so people can wrap their heads around that. The average division size for the Russian divisions between 10, 15,000 troops, 175,000 divided by 10 or 15, we're getting 10 to 12, 15 divisions. Divisions. How many divisions are in the Polish military? I'm just curious. It's not that much. So the fact is, the Russians are still going to receive that in addition to what they've already received. On paper, the Russian military is fully capable of carrying out, I think, broad offensive operations that could not only destroy significant portions of the Ukrainian military, but seize significant territories beyond that which have been lost in the offensives that took place in September, October. But even expanding, for instance, Odessa, making a land bridge with Transnistria, going up, seizing Kharkov, and moving on into Sumy, Dnepropetrovsk, and others. This potential is there, but politically, you have to ask yourself, what are the Russians? What do they want to do? I've talked to a lot of senior Russians, and the concept of escalation management is first and foremost in their mind, meaning that it's not just about how much territory they can take. It's what is the reaction of the West going to be when Russia does X? So they're saying, okay, we do X, NATO does Y. And the idea is to make sure that NATO doesn't overplay its hand, because you don't want an inadvertent, conflict between Russia and NATO forces. So I think whatever's going to happen is going to be at a slower pace than what the potential of action is. I think we're going to see the Russians complete is their number one priority, complete the conquest or liberation, depending on your point of view, of Donetsk. There's still a significant percentage of the Donetsk oblast or republic that's being occupied by Ukrainian forces. So they're going to complete that. And then the other thing that the Russians have talked about is pushing and creating a buffer between the territories of the Donbass, of Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, to push the Ukrainians back so that artillery fire can't reach the soil of Mother Russia, which the newly constituted territories are referred to as that. So we're seeing the battlefield shape up. We see what the intent is. Then the question is, where their priorities going to be? And I think the Battle of Bakhmut is key in this. I think we're going to see the Russians. I call Bakhmut sort of the Gordian knot of the Ukrainian defenses. And once the Russians cut that knot, the defenses will open up. Then Russia has lots of options that they'll exercise at a time and place of their choosing. But the thing that's going to dominate the battlefield going forward is just the simple concept of what I call burn rate versus replenishment rate. Right now the Ukrainians are burning through manpower and material at an extraordinarily high rate. They're suffering tremendous casualties, tremendous losses, and they're not being replenished. NATO doesn't have a pipeline capable of matching the casualty rate. So it's a high burn rate with a very low replenishment rate. Russia, on the other hand, is managing the battle in a different fashion. They have a low burn rate. Some people are saying, 8 to 1, 10 to 1 in terms of casualty ratios. That is, for every one Russian killed or wounded, there's 8 to 10 Ukrainians. That's an exchange that the Russians are willing to undertake all day long. And this is a tragic exchange. I don't want to minimize it. Let's say the Ukrainians are suffering 1,000 casualties a day. That means the Russians are suffering 100 casualties a day or more, 150. That's a lot. That's a lot of people, but it's not what the Ukrainians are suffering. And I think Russia will accept that ratio. And the Russian replenishment rate is massive. As I said, it's not only the 300,000 partially mobilized soldiers that are coming online. There's 80, 90, 100,000 or more volunteers that are being trained and absorbed into the Russian military structures. So, Russia has every advantage. Artillery, massive advantage in artillery. Look at the Ukrainians. They're running out of ammunition, both for their Soviet-era weaponry and their Western-supplied artillery. so when on a good day, the Russians outgunned them 8 to 10 to 1, with the ability to put more firepower on the battlefield than the Ukrainians can respond. On a bad day, the Ukrainians, even if they can get the guns online, don't have the ammunition for the guns or the ability to sustain artillery fire. This is a losing proposition for the Ukrainians. So we're basically going to see, I think, Russia dictating the pace of battle, but again, in a way that keeps escalation management front and center.
Sorry about that. We had technical difficulties, but I knew you were continuing your monologue, Scott, which is good. And I know you got your points across. So thank God for that. Going back to the oh, excuse me, my microphone is not working. Yes, give me a sec. Give me a sec.
Now I can hear you. No, I can't hear you now. No. While you're fixing that, somebody asked a question about what's it like to work with Norman, General Schwartzkopf in the Iraq War. It was a unique experience. But if your mic comes back online, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah.
Yep, gotcha.
Okay, so we're good. You can hear me now.
Yes.
Roger that. Okay, sorry about that. As I was saying, I hope it wasn't the Mirotrovets guys who were interfering in our guys. That's sometimes what happens when you have a stormy weather outside. Yes, you mentioned in a lot of interviews that there are two dimensions to this war: the military one, the kinetic one, obviously the economic one. And from years when the West was going all in February, trying to provoke Russia to a move that they were planning, at least since 2014. And we could tell by the OECD reports that the shelling continued on Donbass and so on. Where do you think they had this idea that economically they could literally punch back and, the demands West was putting visa on? Where did that idea come from?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I had a conversation today with a Russian economist, Mikhail Kazin. He's well known, a former Russian economist who worked in the Yeltsin administration. He's well known on Russian media today, and he basically said that the West operates on a investment model that is basically it's fake money, the ability to print money, invest money, make money out of nothing. Whereas Russia operates on a real economy that's based upon, primarily energy interests, but other interests, things of substance that stay. And the investment economy maybe doesn't understand the real economy. And so certain assumptions were made about how, if we deny Russia, for instance, access to the SWIFT banking facility, if we can cut back on Russian energy exports under the assumption that Russia was totally dependent upon the West, because the West was totally dependent upon Russia. So a lot of assumptions are built in. There's also the fact that since the 1990s, anywhere from 20 to 30% of the Russian economy was basically thoroughly intertwined with the West. So much so that there's many people in the West that believe that because of that, they had sort of trapped Russia, that Russia was trapped in the Western economic embrace and therefore dependent upon the West. And if the West denied Russia that, then this part of the Russian economy would wither and die and bring the rest of the economy down. The goal of sanctions was to, frankly speaking, destroy the viability of the Russian economy. And in doing so, create the potential for domestic political unrest to manifest itself in what's called the Moscow Maidan, basically a replication of what happened in Kiev in February 2014, an uprising that would remove Vladimir Putin from power. This was the thinking of the West. One of the problems is that we telegraphed this over and over again, what we were going to do. I mean, when you have, Joe Biden meeting with Vladimir Putin in Geneva in June 2021, saying, "I'm going to sanction the heck out of you, dude. We're going to give you massive sanctions. We're going to, and then Putin can go back and tell his guys, okay, we now know what they're going to do. Let's prepare for it. Let's have a plan for it. Yeah. Let's think this thing through. Let's create plan B, plan C." Whereas in the West, the United States didn't even coordinate its sanctions policy with Europe. There was a total disconnect between the two. So that when it came time to impose sanctions, Europe is scrambling, and almost immediately, for every sanction they put in place, they're asking for a waiver. We're going to do this, but we need a waiver. Why do you need a waiver? Well, because we're not ready for the consequences of what's about to happen to us. Europe was not ready for this. Europe was not prepared for this. Europe's been playing catch up all along. And it's, and the catch up they're playing isn't catching up. They've been regressing. Every time they catch up, they get a little bit further behind. Europe is economic calamity right now. And the bad news is this isn't even the worst winter that Europe's going to have. Wait till next winter. Right now, Europe is dealing with gas reserves that had been filled up with cheap Russian gas. And where it wasn't, they had to buy the expensive liquid natural gas, and they went bankrupt just doing that. Wait till this winter gets really cold and they dip down through those reserves. And then they're asked to refill them now from zero or close to zero, starting in the spring, with liquid natural gas that they can't afford. And they're not going to be able to get their reserves built up, and then they're going to come rolling into winter and the reserves won't be there. This is a potential disaster for Europe. So I just think there's been a total miscalculation on the part of Europe and the United States. But again, Mikhail Kazan said something interesting that, I've wondered, the United States is literally benefiting from this. We're stealing European industrial jobs. They say 1 in 4 German heavy industry jobs are going to come to the United States. Wow. I mean, if I'm a European, I have to wonder, remember what I said early on, that America is not your friend? America is not your friend. America simply doesn't care about you. America is America's friend. And right now, we told you to get off of cheap Russian gas, but what's the alternative? Expensive American liquid natural gas. And we're not, if we were a true friend, we'd subsidize it and say, hey, we're going to keep the prices low so you guys don't suffer from this. Nope, we're saying pay full market value, and you can't afford it now. I don't know what the energy prices are in Poland right now. I know in Germany they're through the roof. In England, they can't afford to pay their heating bill. In France, they're shutting down industries because of the energy. So it's going up. And where's your friend America? Where's your buddy America? Are they writing you a little check saying, here, let's compensate? No. We're making lots of money off of you. Meanwhile, we have waivers here, waivers there. We found a way around all these sanctions that we put in place. And so it leads you to wonder, did the U.S. government do this on purpose? I mean, I'm not there yet because, frankly speaking, my experience with the U.S. government and conspiracies is the U.S. government is never quite as clever or smart as people like them to believe, that there's a lot of incompetence and things of that nature. This would be very clever on the part of the U.S. to use the sanctioning of Russia as a vehicle to destroy European competition at a time when American economy desperately needed a rejuvenation, which we're going to get from fleeing European heavy industry. I'm not quite there yet, but Mikhail Kazan makes a sound case, and I'm going to have to study it a little bit more.
Well, Scott, I mean, you call it LNG, but everybody here is calling it freedom gas. So freedom gas. I'm complaining. It's freedom, right? I mean, the gas that we were getting, it's like freedom surprise, right? Back in the day, in your day, when you were going against the Iraq invasion. But it's funny because the narrative in Poland is this. Once we cut ourselves off from Russian gas, we're going to become energy independent. It's interesting. How are we going to become energy independent when you're just changing the provider? But that's the narrative that's being sold in the media, on billboards, and in the official propaganda. So people have been, as I said, conditioned to just stop thinking at some point, right? Conditioning is centered on one person. He's all over on the billboards. They say that he's using energy as a weapon, so on and so on. You know, the Darth Vader of the East, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. He is seen as the ultimate bad guy, the guy who brought down the presidential plane on April 10, 2010, which killed a large part, including our president and first lady. He's blamed for basically everything. So we have come to the moment of Putin mania in states like you had during Russiagate and during Trump's time, where everything down to Putin and everything can be blamed on Putin. So as an intelligence officer, somebody who worked in the bad old Soviet Union, somebody who's been observing this for a long time, what's your assessment of the man? Because frankly, you know, I'm pretty sure that if you were Russian and I was Russian, I would not be having the same attitude as the official Western propaganda. Why do you think that is? Why do you think Russians have a different view of their president, for that matter?
Well, let's just start with from where what the starting point is. In the West, we had spent decades during the Cold War viewing the Soviet Union as an enemy, and our academic institutions had been structured in a manner to provide experts on Soviet area studies, experts on the Soviet Union who would be absorbed into the military and civilian communities to, be prepared to deal with the Soviets. The key thing is, if you don't know your enemy accurately, you can't effectively come up with strategies to deal with your enemy. So even though we weren't friends with the Soviets, in fact, we were the enemies, they were the evil empire, we studied them honestly. We made a concerted effort to try and understand the truth, the reality of the Soviet Union, because that was in our interest. When the Soviet Union collapsed at the end of 1991, 1992, the mindset of treating the Soviets as equals, treating them as a power, was swept away by this, we won, USA, USA, we defeated the Soviet Union. Russia was treated as a defeated enemy. I know there's people saying, oh, no, they were our friends. No, Russia was never our friends. I already told you, America doesn't have any friends. Russia was a nation to be exploited economically, and to be dominated politically. We basically, ran Boris Yeltsin. Easy to run because he was desperate for attention and assistance. And we went in, we helped draft the Russian Constitution. We drafted Russian economic laws. We put in place schemes that defrauded the Russian people, empowered the oligarchs. And we all did this as a mechanism of control and a mechanism designed to dissipate Russian strength. The end goal of the United States was to ensure that Russia never again rose up to replicate the kind of power that the Soviet Union had. We never wanted to have in the Russian Eurasian landmass a power that was capable like the Soviet Union. We wanted to bring Russia down and keep Russia down. That was the decade of the 1990s. And from an American perspective, it was a great success. We were very successful in weakening Russia. From a Russian perspective, it was literally one of the worst decades in modern Russian history. Millions died. People don't talk about that. The population shrunk. People lost their pensions. People lost their health care. People lost their jobs. Cities fell into ruin. Industries disappeared. And it was just a horrible time to live. So the reason why I bring this up is you have to understand that to understand Vladimir Putin. You see, if you read the literature, Vladimir Putin is, the evil incarnate. He's some sort of Voldemort type character, Sauron. who sits back in Mordor and plans with the evil ball. He can see everything. He was a mid-level KGB officer in Dresden, Germany, when the wall came down. Not the center of power, not at all. He was one of many people of similar rank and similar capabilities. When he went back to St. Petersburg when he left, he was back into trolling academia for potential recruitment opportunities. I mean, that ain't high power. Trust me, that's not high power. If you're trolling academia for wayward PhD students, you've got a problem. You're not as influential as you think you are. He was driving a taxi to try and make ends meet, and basically he transitioned himself out of that job, and he got into the administration of Anatoly Sobchak, the mayor of St. Petersburg, and you saw him gradually rise through the ranks. I'll let other people, describe that history. But my point is, this isn't, again, a man who is the secret power. He's an average Russian with above average intelligence who's working the system. And he, through a combination of serendipity and talent, got himself positioned to where every time they were looking for someone new to come in to do a job, he got put in. Next thing you know, he's in Moscow. He's brought into the family, the Yeltsin family. He's not family, by the way. He's not, the daughter. He's not the son-in-law. He's not an oligarch. He's not these wolves that are running around Yeltsin at that time, waiting for Yeltsin to die. He's Vladimir Putin, the outsider, who comes in and is basically the only man that Yeltsin can trust. When everything else is going to hell in a handbasket, Yeltsin says, I need you to run this job. Take over the FSB, clean it up, become prime minister. And then when he turned to Putin and said, I want you to become president, Putin went, no, no, I'm not qualified for that job. I don't want that. That's not where I'm at. And Yeltsin said, that's why you're going to take the job. And Putin, he was the accidental president. And that's the thing I need to point out. His presidency was an accident. It wasn't meant to happen. It just did. But the problem is, because he's not one of the corrupt inner circle, he's actually a guy, when given the job, seeks to accomplish the job. And so he was given the task of being president, and he turned to that task. And his goal was to resurrect Russia, the exact opposite trajectory that the United States wanted. The United States was hoping that he would become some sort of compliant Yeltsin-like clone, or barring that he would lose the election that was held in 2000 and be replaced by somebody who would be a Yeltsin clone. The United States, the Clinton administration didn't think that Putin was going to win that election. In fact, nobody did. He had no political support, no base, no a party that wasn't worth it. But there were some surprises. The political party that he joined became much more influential in the parliamentarian elections. With a parliament behind him, he was able to move forward with legislation. He was decisive on the issue of Chechnya. He won the hearts and minds of the Russian people. They had confidence in his ability to move forward and accomplish jobs, and he started doing it. Was he perfect? No. But I'll tell you what, compare and contrast Russia 1999 with Russia today. Take any Russian city, pick one, I don't care what, any of them, orders of magnitude better today. In America, we keep at, when politicians are running for office, the question people say, are you better off today than you were when so-and-so came into office? And if the answer is no, then you need to vote for someone else. Well, just about every Russian has to say, oh, we're better off today than we were when Vladimir Putin came into office. He saved Russia. He preserved Russia. Russia was heading down the cesspool of history, and he saved Russia. Again, he's not perfect. I'm sure people can come up and say he made a mistake here, he made a mistake there. Of course he did. But the first thing we have to understand is that from the perspective of American academia, which was reconditioned after the fall of the Soviet Union to not study Russia, but study how to exploit Russia. This is where people like Michael McFaul come from, academics whose job isn't to know Russia, but know how to use Russia to the benefit of the United States. To these academics, Vladimir Putin is literally the personification of evil because he stands for everything they don't want to be happening in Russia. He stands for a strong, independent Russia who's not going to be beholden to the United States. And you see this. Look at Fiona Hill, read her PhD thesis. I did. You can take any of these these Angela Stent, read her PhD thesis. I did. They're the same thing. They're basically a thesis predicated on the notion of autocracy and dictatorship, and how Putin is the ultimate autocrat and dictator, and how he has destroyed Russian democracy, etc. Destroyed Russian democracy. What the heck did you think existed in 1999? Do people understand that Boris Yeltsin put tanks in the street of Moscow in October of 1993 and fired on the parliament because the parliament didn't support him? Do they know that Boris Yeltsin allowed the presidency to be bought by American money in 1996? There was no democracy in Russia when Vladimir Putin came in. Vladimir Putin wanted to build democratic institutions, but how can you build a democratic institution when all the building blocks are in the form of non-governmental organizations bought and paid for by British intelligence and American intelligence for the sole purpose of undermining Vladimir Putin? So yes, I'm not going to sit here and say that democracy runs free in Russia. What I'm going to say is the biggest enemy to democracy in Russia isn't Vladimir Putin. It's the United States and Great Britain, who go in and, destroy any confidence that the Russians can have in their democratic institutions by trying to buy opposition politicians who will do their bidding. And this is a hint to all you Polish opposition politicians. When you sit down with an American diplomat, when you sit down with an American official from the embassy, they're not your friend. They're your future controller. They're wanting to own you, to buy you, to use you. And that's what America does. And Putin's been struggling against this from day one, but we don't know Putin. And here's the other thing I'll say to close on this one. By focusing on the man, you forget the country. People need to understand Russia's a big country. It's a complex country. One man does not govern the country. The idea that Vladimir Putin sits back in his office every day and gets his little bowl, power ball that Tsar looks at and can govern over and push things and make people die and all this stuff. No, this is a massive bureaucracy. The Russian system is a massive bureaucratic system. It has experts at every level that push policy up based upon direction that comes down. And the end result is actually some well thought out policy positions that are matched to resources, matched to clearly defined objectives, and Vladimir Putin, as the executive, implements it. It's sort of I would imagine, sort of a compliment to him for people to say that Russia's a dictatorship, because the implication there is that Russia is running the way Vladimir Putin wants it to run. But that's not so much a reflection on Putin as it is on Russia and the way Russians govern. It's massive, it's big, mistakes are made, corruption exists. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't, but something this big actually functions very well. And a large part of that is, of course, the executive style of Vladimir Putin, but an even larger part is the reality of the Russian state, which is ignored every time you say Vladimir Putin. Every time you say Putin this, Putin that, Putin this, you're showing your ignorance, because Vladimir Putin is one man. Russia is a nation of 158 million. And Russia will exist long after Vladimir Putin's gone. And Vladimir Putin knows that.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the exact Poland, that basically it's Putin's army, it's Putin's invasion. There's no general staff, there's no generals, there's no army. It's all a one-man show. And if you personify politics in that way, it's very in Putin. That's all true. And seeing this projection, as I'm observing internal American politics fairly closely, also due to my PhD, that everything that's dumb about Russian observers and Russian whispers in the States sooner or later is going to find replication in Poland. So we're really in the same ballpark here at Poles and Americans. And it's kind of sad, but it is what it is. Scott, I've had you for an hour. I want to ask you one final question, because I think touches on many people think about recently. You're a weapons inspector. There's that famous doomsday clock that I think the American Atomic Scientists Association has going on, and I think this to 12 recently, from what I saw. You were right in the thick of it after the INF, and 30 years ago, it was signed by Gorbachev and Reagan. Many people hated Reagan for that, which is worth noting. But how are we to the reality of a potential nuclear war, considering what many people Putin to saying that, he's going to launch those nukes one way or another, apparently a couple of days ago, which is obviously a misinterpretation. But how the potential of something as big as a nuclear war blowing up anytime soon? These are things that we have to keep in mind. I think that's the most important thing we have to keep in mind.
Well, one of the amazing things about the INF Treaty, and again, I'm not here to promote my book, but I actually took time to write a book about it, was how dangerous the situation was in the 1980s with the introduction of the SS-20, a new Russian intermediate-range missile with 3 nuclear warheads, matched by the Pershing II and the ground-launched cruise missile, and how close we were to actually having a nuclear conflict in Europe that would immediately expand into a general nuclear exchange. And one of the important things about the INF Treaty is that it started a process of not just limiting nuclear weapons, but getting rid of, eliminating an entire class of nuclear weapons, the intermediate and the short-range nuclear missiles, and then opening the door for not limitation treaties like in the 70s, strategic arms limitation treaties, limiting the growth, but reduction, strategic arms reduction treaties, shrinking the strategic arsenals. And this door was opened. Unfortunately, when the Soviet Union went away, so did an important aspect of arms control, which is the notion of reciprocity, meaning it's a mutual treaty. The United States was feeling its oats. We were the sole remaining superpower. And I think the feeling was we didn't have to treat the Russians with the same level of respect. So we were trying to shove things down the Russian throats on the negotiating table that were politically unacceptable for the parliament. And so we had this START 1 treaty. It was signed at the end of July of 1991 in the last moments of the Gorbachev era of the Soviet Union. But then START 2 and START 3 never really got off the ground. We voluntarily implemented some of the procedures, but the arms control sort of started to dissipate the arrogance of the American position that we're the winners, you're the losers, we get to dictate the outcome. This was translated into, for instance, in 2001, the Bush administration, George W. Bush, withdrawing from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which was one of the foundational treaties in arms control relations, one that cemented the notion of mutually assured destruction by denying each side the ability to defend against a nuclear attack. Therefore, if one side is attacked, the other side will retaliate, everybody dies, so don't attack. That was the idea. Then we had the INF Treaty. That became inconvenient in 2019. Donald Trump, withdrew from that. So the United States has shown itself to be a very bad negotiating partner, very bad partner in terms of arms control, because whenever a treaty becomes inconvenient for us, we rip it up and we move on and seek a relationship that is 100% beneficial to us. And this is reflected in the New START Treaty. That's the only arms control treaty that remains between Russia and the United States. The Biden administration agreed to a 5-year extension when they came into office. That means this treaty expires in 2026. It's not that far away, a little bit more than 3 years. When it expires, there's no option to re-up it for 5 years, which means if a new treaty isn't put in place, the strategic arsenals of Russia and the United States are going to start breaking free and gravitate. We're going to have a new arms race with no control. How do we get control? There was recently an effort to have a consultative meeting in Cairo between the Russians and the United States about the START treaty to discuss some of these issues. But the Russians pulled out, and what they said is there's literally nobody we can deal with in the United States that we can trust. I mean, how can we deal with America when their policy is to kill Russians in Ukraine? How we can deal with America when they aren't trustworthy negotiating partners, where the rule of law means nothing to them. And to give you an example, that the Russian ambassador to the United States, Anatoly Antonov, was the negotiator for New START treaty. He's frustrated by about a couple things, but he's come to realize that he was taken for a ride by the United States. That the United States made certain representations based upon definitions that were thought to be mutually understood, only to redefine these definitions going forward, such as irreversible. A B-52 bomber to be taken away from being counted as a delivery mechanism has to have its ability to deliver nuclear weapons irreversibly altered. But all the United States did is clip a couple wires, put some tape around it, and say that's it. But anytime we want, we can untape it, reclip the wires, and it's a nuclear bomber again. The Russians are like, that ain't irreversible. Irreversible is actually sawing the bomber in half so it can never fly again. But that's not what we did. The same thing on Trident missile submarine. We said we're going to irreversibly withdraw these launch tubes from service. But all we did is, put in a little thing here or there. It's all reversible. We even brag about it. The admirals would brag to Congress, don't worry about it. If there's ever a crisis, we can get these babies back up and running in no time soon. The Russians are going, that wasn't the intent of the treaty, guys. The intent of the treaty is to irreversibly remove them. So the United States isn't a reliable partner, and the Russians are concerned about that. But even if the Russians wanted to negotiate a treaty with the United States, we're out of time. Treaties are inherently political. You need the Senate to ratify this, which means that an administration has to be working on the Senate for some time now. This is why the INF treaty wasn't ratified until the second term, late in the second term of the Reagan administration. So with the Biden administration, they have 2 more years, and right now they're not talking. So let's say even if the Russians and the United States wanted to get together right now and start talking, there's an election is going to come, and nobody's going to run for election based upon the notion of bold arms control, because it's very easy for their opponents to snipe. You're bad for America. You're weak for America. Da, da, da. So there ain't going to be any meaningful talks for the next 2 years. And remember, the treaty expires in 2026. So they're going to have to wait until November 24 to find out who's going to be the person negotiating with them in January of 25. Is it going to be Biden, or is it going to be a new president? But then January 25, it gives you 1 year to negotiate a treaty. Treaties of this complexity take about 5 years to negotiate. This is impossible. This is literally mission impossible. And the reason why I bring up this arms control is that without arms control, there will be an arms race. And the weapons today are of such an advanced nature that there is no margin for error, that one mistake will mean the end of the world. Now we come to doctrine. Biden ran on a platform of what he called the sole purpose doctrine. That is, the sole purpose of the American nuclear arsenal should be nuclear deterrence. That is, if you use nuclear weapons against us, we will use nuclear weapons against you. But instead, he continued this policy of nuclear preemption, the ability of the United States to launch a nuclear attack preemptively in a non-nuclear environment anytime we wanted, based upon standards that we alone set, holding the world hostage to our nuclear arsenal. This was put in place by the Bush administration after 9/11. Barack Obama had said, I'm going to support the sole purpose, but he had 8 years and he couldn't do it, because you can't do it. The establishment, the interagency, whatever you want to call it, will not allow this to happen. Biden came in, was not able to do it. The national security strategy that was published in October contains the nuclear posture review. And the nuclear posture review is the exact same policy that George W. Bush had in 2001, 2002. So now you're the Russians, and you're looking at that and you say, okay, and Putin made a comment about this. He said, right now, we're not going to be the first to use nuclear weapons. But if you fire nuclear weapons at us, we're not going to be the second to use them either, meaning that it's launch on detection. They detect the launch, then they're going to send their missiles out, and then the world's over. The beauty of launch on detection is that if it's intercontinental ballistic missiles, you'll have a buffer of around 30 minutes before you have to make that decision to launch. So that if there's a mistake, if there's an error, people can get on the hotline and work it out. But the United States is developing technologies that give us the belief that we can shoot down Russian missiles. So this ballistic missile defense thing gives us a false sense of security, even though Russia has developed hypersonic technology that obviates this. Two, we have other technologies that we can use as a preemptive strike. We can go in and try and decapitate Russian leadership and Russian strategic launch capabilities, creating the possibility of an American preemptive strike designed to nullify Russia's nuclear deterrence so that we think we can launch a nuclear war, win it, and not be hit by the Russians. And for the Russians to allow this to happen means they no longer have nuclear deterrence, and they're going to be forever, a prisoner of American power politics. So what Putin said is, hey, look, we're going to have to re-examine our nuclear posture, and we may have to take, model ourselves after you and come up with a preemptive strike, meaning that if we see you preparing to launch an attack, we're not going to wait for you to launch. We're going to go ahead and preempt it on our own. Guys, two preemptive nuclear postures at a time when neither side is talking and there is no arms control safety net is a recipe for mutual suicide. It's literally both sides putting the gun up to each other's head, and we're going to pull the triggers. So we're at a greater risk now of nuclear conflict than we have been at any time since the Cold War. It's very, very disturbing, very frightening.
Well, that's a sad memento, unfortunately, but it is what it is. But I think those words needed to ring out, especially in the Polish context, because sometimes I think we lose from sight how close we're actually coming to disaster. And you said, I think it was with Jeff Norman on your regular weekly show that Poland, Ukraine, guess which countries are going to be hit first, right?
Yeah.
So I hope we'll bear some political fruit and some analytical fruit, because I still want to see my capital, Warsaw. It's not the best of cities, but I don't want to see it go up in smoke one way or another. Condoleezza Rice said once, we don't want the smoking gun to be in the form of a mushroom. Scott, once again, your people need to read your book. Everybody watching this, maybe get a Polish translation going, God willing. Hopefully this is a really good primer on where we need to go and where we were. Family histories that I will not dispel at this moment, but it's in this book right now that you can read. You can order it from the links that we have added in the description box. Scott, thank you once again with us this evening. I hope we can do this again sometime in the new year without the technical difficulties that we had today, but thank you for sticking around. Even though we had the Christmas from all of us in Poland. May that snow coming down in the great state of New York, at least on Christmas Eve. That's the most important part. And hope to see you again in the new year. And thank you once again from all of us here. Stay safe. God bless, and in touch.
Thanks for having me. Happy New Year and Merry Christmas.